Thanks for coming and listening to me ramble on about Holywell Priory. This is the sort of recent excavations. I'm going to focus on that, but I'm also going to sort of introduce the work that's been done on this site over the last kind of 10 years or so. I just need to get rid of some of these. Okay, over the last sort of a 30-year period, and also sort of focus on the sort of last 7 years of PCA's work, basically. So right, here we go. I mean, the site location. So we're in London. We're north of the River Thames, just on the edge of Hackney. There's the sort of Thames here, Hackney's here, and then there's the site itself, which is sort of on this closer map. London Wall is here, just to sort of give a bit of kind of location. And then you've got Bishopsgate running into Shoreditch High Street here, and this is the site where I've been working and sort of where I'm going to focus this talk on. The site area itself, this is we've got Holywell Lane to the south, Shoreditch High Street to the east, King John Court to the west, and then Newton Yard to the north. And then just sort of faintly running across the site, we've got the London Overground Viaduct, which divides the site into the western side and the eastern side. And that's sort of the modern site, if you like, on Shoreditch High Street. So the previous interventions were made up of these trenches in 1989, which was an evaluation done by Barney Sloan of Dogler, which is the sort of Department of Greater London Archaeology. And he didn't really have to sort of worry about the modern viaduct. There was a much earlier viaduct running down the western side of the site. So he had this kind of open area to sort of do these trenches, and he started to reveal some of the medieval archaeology. Much later on, for the construction of that viaduct in 2006, Mola, the Museum of London, did 3 trenches before they built that modern viaduct. So they sort of went through this strip here, and they revealed some big parts of the Priory, which I'll kind of show you a little bit later. Then we're on to PCA. So in 2015, we did quite a large excavation down the western side. So like I said, the viaduct is now in place, sort of dividing the site west and east. So in 2015, we did this excavation on the western side, and it's for a commercial development, basically. So it's sort of building up loads of different trenches, building up a picture of this site over the years. And then 2019, this is where I kind of got involved as a supervisor on the site. I was doing some excavations on 2 trenches here prior to this sort of development in this side of the site, on the eastern side of the site, and before they did some piling, before we could sort of do this main trench, if you like, on this main development, which is on the eastern side. And this was the most recent work, which was done in 2020. So this, we've only just started to look at some of the finds, go through some of the records and things like that very, very recently. So some of the stuff I'm going to tell you is pretty fresh, and we haven't produced an assessment report or anything like that. So a lot of it is sort of preliminary phasing, sort of very early sort of interpretations of the site, but that added with what we've done previously and what Mola's done previously, and a little bit what Barney Sloan's done previously, we've built up quite a complex picture of the site. Okay, so the first bit really is looking at some of the prehistoric stuff. We didn't get a lot of prehistoric stuff during the 2020 excavation, but the sort of features we did get, I'll just show you in a bit, but just to put that in context, just down the road from this site, a site called Principal Place, which was just sort of on that cusp between Shoreditch High Street and Bishopsgate, they found a large assemblage of Neolithic pottery, and I think it was one of the largest in London of Neolithic pottery. It's sort of thought that a lot of the prehistoric activity in London is confined to the Eyots, places around the Thames, but what we're sort of finding is as we're on the terraces, we're also getting little pockets of sort of prehistoric activity. Just this picture here, it's just to sort of show some of that early sort of prehistoric, I think this is Bronze Age. This is actually the Greenwich Peninsula, but it just gives an idea of sort of the farming that was going on around that time. I mean, like I said, we are on that gravel terrace in the upper Walbrook Valley, so not quite as close to the Thames as this, but still sort of an area where there is possibility of farming that wasn't quite expected. So here, these are the prehistoric features. Like I said, there's not a lot really, but enough to sort of get interested in and show that there is prehistoric activity on the site, and to sort of add to that sort of prehistoric picture that's kind of forming in these sort of areas of London. We just think we've got some, I'll just sort of highlight these kind of gullies, which are maybe field boundaries, features associated with agriculture. Fortunately, they carry on beyond the site boundary, so there is probably maybe a bit more going on. Just also worth pointing out with this particular picture, this is the construction going on behind us. So as we were excavating, sort of heading east to west, and this is sort of right at the very end of the site, we are being followed by concrete and steel, and that is sort of coming up behind us. As we sort of hand over areas, they're constructing their building at quite a rapid rate, probably not as fast as they'd like, but sort of quite a rapid rate. And then here, just a close-up of one of those features. And in the fill, we did get a small quantity, not as much as we're getting at Principal Place, but a small quantity of flint and bits of pottery in the fills, which we think at this stage is possibly Bronze Age, so not as early as Neolithic, but still kind of prehistoric. And then we're kind of looking at the Roman sort of features, which I'm going to introduce here. So this is just to give a bit of context. So we're looking at Roman London, sort of north from Southwark, with kind of London Bridge, and then the city itself surrounded by the river wall, which is kind of a later addition, and then the outer sort of land wall, which is probably 2nd, 3rd century, the river wall, 3rd, 4th century. But where actually our site is outside of that wall into this sort of land in this kind of upper Walbrook Valley. Probably, and maybe not quite so much now, but originally maybe seen as marginal land, probably prone to flooding due to that Walbrook sort of valley and its tributaries, the river, flooding that land, maybe not being used that much. But some of the sort of things we're finding showing that there's a little bit more going on than maybe previously thought. One thing worth pointing out is that along the road coming out of the north, sort of the north gate, out of Bishopsgate, you are getting the Roman cemetery. So there's bits and pieces going on up there. But so just to sort of start off with some of our Roman activity, this is from the 2015 excavation. We've got like a river course or river channel running down this sort of western side of the excavation, which we think is either a tributary to the Walbrook or possibly part of the Walbrook itself. So there's a river channel along that, which would have been present in the Roman period, and they've sort of excavated a ditch running parallel with that, which you can see a bit sort of better on this picture, a bit of a close-up of that, which is the same sort of ditch-like feature next to that watercourse, probably to do with farming, probably sort of draining the land and sort of preparing for some agricultural activity. So in 2019, that early trench that we sort of started, we excavated, we sort of had a ditch, which you can see in section here, which is similar to sort of what we had in the 2015 excavations. So remember, we're on the eastern side of that railway viaducts, but we're still getting these kind of ditches, which we think are 1st, 2nd century. So there's activity in that quite early Roman period, preparing maybe this marginal sort of land, this flooded land for farming, basically. And then when we came back in 2020, we actually revisited that ditch, we found more of it, and we excavated along its full length. And this is just a working shot showing this excavated Roman ditch, which we provisionally dated to the 1st, 2nd century. We think it's a field boundary, and possibly with a bank, and then maybe that bank was infilled and sort of, it was all leveled off when the when that ditch went out of use, which we think was actually infilled during the Roman period. And we did find some pottery, some CBM, and quite a large Roman coin, which we thought was a denarii, which gives it that kind of early Roman date. And then we did find, I mean, like I said, we were quite close to the Roman cemetery coming out of London on that North Road. The Mola in their previous excavations did find Roman burials, and we've also, it's not the greatest photo, you'll have to sort of, there's an outline of a hip, some legs, and that is buried next to that quite early ditch. So this is a sort of north-south aligned grave, or possible multiple parts, because we did find other little bits of Roman sort of dead within this feature. So it could be several disarticulated, articulated bits of human remains within a feature which could not be may not be a grave. And then we're moving into the a little bit later, which is actually that ditch has been filled in, and cut into that ditch and constructed on top of that ditch fill is what we think's a corn dryer, or part of a corn dryer, which would be a T-shaped corn dryer. So it's constructed using CBM, ceramic building material from a Roman building, and we think it's, if the ditch is maybe 1st, 2nd century, this is 3rd, 4th century. So farming is starting to take hold, and they're actually processing some of the corn they're harvesting on the site itself, in the corner of a field, perhaps. I mean, this just kind of roughly sort of works by using heat, indirect heat, just to dry out the corn. You're not cooking the corn, you're not roasting it, you're just using like a hypercaust. So this is the lower part of that corn dryer. So there'd be a fire pit, and then warm air would be heating below these tiles to sort of create some heat, just to sort of to dry out the corn, which would probably be later stored. Once it's dried, it stops it kind of sort of going moldy, or sort of whatever problems the moisture would bring. And then we also found a Roman pot, which I think is a place deposit within a pit. Didn't seem to be associated with any sort of human remains, so we're not sure if it's a part of an actual grave. And the contents is unknown at this stage. We need to sort of look at that, do some analysis. So I don't know if it's cremation, or if it would have contained food stuff as an offering, maybe honey, something like that. But it's definitely quite interesting. It's a pot that is placed. So we've sort of getting some Roman activity in this part of the site, and sort of things are going on before the medieval period sort of comes along. And this is where I kind of move on to now with the Priory itself. And this is just Wingard's panorama of London in 1540, which shows Priory Church with a spire, and the building itself within what looks like a wall. And I think that's looking from the sort of city wall north towards Shoreditch and towards Holywell Priory. And then we'll go into a bit more detail here with, just to put it into some context, this is a map showing religious houses within and around medieval London. I just try to draw your attention to the one, so we've got medieval London here, the River Thames here, and then sort of priories and abbeys in Southwark, and then sort of we're looking at ones outside that medieval city, and Holywell Priory really quite far north up here. Sort of outlying places. I'll draw your attention to St Mary, Clerkenwell, which we think is a sister priory or connected to Holywell Priory, because it's the same order. So Holywell Priory is an Augustinian priory. And it covers about, it's a 9-acre site, and would have housed Augustinian nuns. This is quite an interesting sort of plaque on modern day Curtain Road, and it's the only real sort of visible marker to the presence of Holywell Priory in the modern day. And we just sort of, it's on the side of a building, it kind of just sort of draws our attention to it, and it's just quite an interesting marker, sort of where the priory, where the precinct was located. So we just got a bit of information saying it's founded in 1152, 1158. There's some uncertainty of that foundation. Dissolved in 1539, and then it's bounded by Curtain Road, Holywell Lane, Bateman Row, and Shoreditch High Street. And this brings us a bit more to the actual plan of the precinct itself. This was actually a 1922 plan, and it's sort of quite a large 9-acre site with Shoreditch High Street, Holywell Lane, Curtain Road, and then the actual precinct itself with the church and sort of surrounding orchard, gardens, and sort of cloisters, living area to do with the priory, all within this sort of wall precinct. And then this is where this is our sort of excavated area, the site where we've done a lot of the excavation over that sort of 30-year period. And this is where we're going to focus on for the majority of this part of the talk. So in this sort of church that we've got here, and it's quite plain, quite a sort of schematic, just a sort of outline. And we're going to actually, through what we've done with the excavation, put that together and show a more sort of fuller picture of what that church would have looked like. But there's a few details I'll draw your attention to. On Holywell Lane, we've got a gatehouse and a sort of walkway up to a doorway within the church. And some of those things I can show you that we've revealed during the excavation. So in Barney Sloane and his trenches and Molar and their trenches, they built up this conjecture of the actual church, of the actual priory church. So they found a bit of the south wall, a bit of the north wall, and some column bases within the sort of main part of the church. And also Barney Sloane started to find bits of the transept and some of these cells. The St Mary's Church and Priory in Clerkenwell, which I referred to, had a cruciform church. So that's kind of based on that as well. So that sort of additional information we've sort of built up. They've started to create this picture of what this church was, sort of what it would have looked like. And then it's sort of founded 1150, but we haven't got any sort of evidence of that early church, not on our excavation. But this main sort of church we've got here would have sort of been 1190 probably, and been standing up until around about 1539. So then the recent excavations in 2015, which was sort of down this kind of western side, which is this sort of trench area here, we start to build up a different kind of picture, adding a bit more detail to that church, adding more to this plan here, and adding to the Molar sort of their conjecture, if you like. So we've got a gatehouse down here. We've got an avenue leading up to a portico entrance, and then we've got this full sort of south wall and north wall of this 1190 church, and then we've got the cloisters and the western range to the north. So just focusing on that gatehouse, we're looking at these two rooms here, and then there's the curtain wall itself, and it's sort of east-west curtain wall, which we found. This is the plan of it. And then if we go onto this photograph here, this is that sort of the physical remains, if you like, of that that gatehouse with this curtain wall, and then the actual gatehouse itself. So this is that's looking west, and then you've got sort of these rooms inside the gatehouse. So that's something that's worth pointing out, which is a detail we found on the outside of the curtain wall, which we believe is the actual holy well, and that was taken from, probably was a natural spring already there, and then formalized in this well, this kind of trough-like shape. And there's just an elevation of how we sort of attach that wall, and then this kind of sort of brick stone structures of the actual well, which was on the outside, so the public could access that well, and it was there as a for people to get water basically from this from well, which we think where it gets its name. This is the gatehouse from an example from Bristol, and it's the sort of main entrance to St Augustine's Abbey in Bristol. And it's sort of how we think our gatehouse would have looked. I mean, it's a lot more elaborate with this upper bit here, but we've got a kind of main carriageway gate and a postern gate, and that would have been the access route to the priory from that sort of Holywell Lane. And this is just a kind of good example of maybe what, give you an idea of what that gatehouse would have looked like when it was standing. So that gatehouse takes you from up through this avenue, which was a metal surface, and it led to the church itself, to the portico entrance just here, which sort of this avenue would have taken you through to. And here's some detail of that portico entrance. There's a similar example found at St Mary Clerkenwell that had an entranceway similar to that on that sort of western corner, and they had a tower coming sort of sprung up from that gatehouse. Sorry, from that portico entrance. We can't sort of speculate on that tower at the moment because we're only sort of looking at very sort of early sort of phasing and understanding of the site. But there's some nice sort of detail of that portico entrance. And this is the south wall of the church, which is sort of this one kind of key thing about this site was very, very good survival. So we've got this sort of standing south wall of this church with this elevation showing you sort of that stonework. We think it would have been rendered on the outside, and it was made up of Kentish ragstone, Reigate and Carnstone, so a mixture of stone, but probably not being visible. Would have probably been rendered, especially on the outside of that wall. This is the inside of the wall. And then we're looking at the church plan itself, with the portico entrance down here, that south wall that we just talked about earlier, and then the column bases, the north wall, and then the cloister alley, which would have formed the cloister garth. So these are the sort of things we were kind of revealing as we did this excavation in 2015. And that is looking at that south wall. So we're looking west, we've got the south wall here, we're in the south aisle, and the two column bases into the nave, and then again we've got that really good survival. And these darker patches here are our burials buried within the church itself. And we did find a couple, probably about 30 medieval graves overall during that excavation. Here's two kind of nice examples of medieval graves found during that excavation in 2015. Then a bit more close up of the actual column bases themselves, made of carnstone. They're sitting on these are sort of pier bases with circular columns which would have supported the arcade in the south aisle, and they're made up of shaped blocks which would have formed the kind of overall column. So that's kind of an interesting sort of architectural feature of our medieval church. And then this is again that great survival. So we're inside the church here. We're looking south towards the north, in the north aisle towards the nave, and we've got a really nice spread of Westminster tile, which was probably one of the highlights of the excavation. So here we're going to go in a bit more detail about those Westminster tiles. So we think the 13th century, and they're usually associated with monastic sites. The common tile type also in St Mary Clerkenwell, and this particular excavation, we had the largest spread of tiles outside of Westminster Abbey. Lots of sort of designs that are typical of this kind of tile, but there's probably one or two that are new and not seen in other assemblages. So we've probably got a few that sort of brand new styles of Westminster tile. And these are probably status items and added as the priory comes into money. So this is probably a later sort of building campaign. And then as rich benefactors favour the Augustinian order, they donate money and they can start to sort of add these kind of nice features to the church. And there's just a bit more sort of close-up of some shields, some details, some flowers, sort of fleur-de-lis type designs on these this Westminster tile floor. And then it's quite interesting. We found during the excavation these late medieval shaped bricks, which we think would have gone into a vaulted ceiling. We didn't obviously have the survival of the ceiling, but we had these bricks, which showed maybe some investment, that they can afford sort of a grand ceiling and more architectural sort of embellishments, which all add to the church itself. And then we're into the cloisters here. So we've got the bases from the column in the north aisle, and they've got the northern wall, and then the cloister alley, the cloister garth. So that wall here is this wall looking kind of north-south here, and we've got this little wall here sort of forming a room coming off that cloister alley, and that's kind of sort of attached to the church on that sort of northern side of the church. And then so from those 2015 excavations, we kind of did a revised conjecture. So we sort of added this little doorway here, this portico entrance. We've got a lot more of the south wall. We sort of, with the southern columns and the northern columns, we've got a double aisled church, and then we've got part of the cloisters here. So, and then this western excavation on the western side is fired up. We're sort of added to that conjecture. So on 2020 is where we started to dig on this side, and that's what we're going to go to next. But to start that, in 2019, we did this little trench along this north, sort of the north wall trench, and we started to reveal the south wall of the church down this eastern side. And eventually this survives because it becomes a property boundary, and this upper part of the wall is actually post-medieval. That survives because of this sort of use as this property boundary. And this slide here is giving me a combination of pictures showing that south wall of that church. We've got a long rectified photograph here showing the full length of sort of survival, about 20 meters long of survival. And then down this western end, which is this sort of bit here, this kind of bit here, we've got this blocking where in the later sort of post-medieval period, this would have been open, this would have been part of the church. They sort of closed that off. This just shows that sequence, which is this bit here, shows a sequence of medieval stone and the chalk foundations. And then you get a change in wall, so the chalk foundation gets a lot thinner down this end. And we think this is actually an inner precinct boundary wall. So around about here, this is the end of the church. And then this is where you start to get a boundary wall within the precinct itself. So you've got sort of areas of space being divided by quite a substantial wall. And then this is from the 2019 excavation, an aerial view. We've got the south wall here, and then we've got that south transept coming off here, this east-west wall, this north-south wall, and then we've got additional cells added to that, and then burials within the transept, and within these little sort of cells, these little rooms that have been later added. And then over to this eastern side, we've got a kind of cemetery area, and we'll sort of, the 2020 excavations revealed more of this survival, more of the structure. And this is coming into the 2020 excavations where we've got that starting to reveal the south transept, and we're doing some sort of recording the walls. A lot of these walls are kind of don't survive. A lot of it's just chalk foundations and stone foundations. And this is different views of several phases, which is where we're sort of looking at with preliminary phasing. So like I said, we haven't done a lot of post-ex at the moment. We're looking south at these different chapels. There's a chapel, inner chapel, and an outer wall, and then this area here, and then we're looking at sort of a later phase of building this larger stone foundation with a buttress off to the corner there, and then going round to the south. And that's a sort of later phase because of this style of buttress, which is we think is late medieval. And here we go into a little bit more detail of that chapel itself. So we've got this transept, we've got the south wall, and then this additional chapel. So this is combining 2019 and the 2020 excavation, and this is the early sort of phase, which we think is from this 1190 church. And that goes into an additional chapel added on, which we think's around about 1350. So you've got these two chapels forming this church down round about this sort of the eastern end, the eastern side of the south transept. And then this here is a much later addition, sort of very late medieval chapel, probably maybe late 15th, early 16th century. We've got this French buttress, which is, sort of comes in style 1400s onwards, and possibly, which is suggested from previous excavations, is in this area, could be Lord Lovell's chapel. He was the Chancellor of Exchequer during that time, during that late medieval period, and he's thought to have moved into the outer precinct, and he became an important benefactor for the priory. But we'll have to sort of, that's just a sort of hypothesis at the moment. But again, these are interesting structural elements, and they're east of the transept, and you know, they've kind of been revealed, and they need sort of further looking into what were they, what was going on, what were they used for. And then heading away from the church down the sort of far eastern side of the site, and we sort of excavated quite a large boundary ditch, which I think would have been the definitely early eastern boundary of the precinct. Maybe they cut this ditch and then they acquired land further towards Shoreditch High Street. But it's a very sort of early ditch, and we think it's kind of filled in quite quickly. Sort of 15 meters long by 4.5 meters wide, and then almost 2 meters deep. Not a lot of fills, so just think 1 or 2 fills identified at this stage. So we think backfill quite rapidly, not building up over time with lots of different kinds of fills. And then we get into the Priory Cemetery, which we started to reveal in 2019. There's the skull against the south wall of the church. You can see a skull here, there's a skull there. So on that kind of eastern side, away from the transept, we started to reveal that cemetery. We had about 35 sort of graves, human remains, individual skeletons found during that excavation. So later in 2020, when we did that full excavation last year, we started to find a lot more. We're actually in the main part of the cemetery, where we found over 200 skeletons were exhumed on this occasion. And all these graves orientated east-west, which suggests they're all Christian burials, as you'd expect on a medieval priory cemetery site. And the cemetery was in use for probably several hundred years, from the 13th to the 16th century. And there's areas where there's intercutting. A later interment disturbs an earlier grave, so there's graves being disturbed during that life of the cemetery. We've probably got quite a mixture of human remains. They seem to be adults and juvenile, and on sort of early sort of analysis, quite an even representation of men and women. So not necessarily nuns from the priory, maybe sort of people from the wider community being buried in the cemetery. So here we've got that cemetery management, if you like, where you've got a grave that's been deposited, but when they laid that grave, they disturbed an earlier grave. Rather than dig a new pit, they just laid the bones on the legs of this individual. So you're a bit unlucky if you're that particular individual, not so bad if you're the one underneath, but that's probably not how it was supposed to happen, but that's how they decided to make space over a cemetery that's in such a long use. And then that's the age range we're talking about. So here we've got a young child, 7 years old, and then a very young child, probably 6 months to a year. I mean, these sort of aren't going to be living and working in the priory, so that suggests they're coming from that wider community. A little bit of pathology here. This looks like we've got a break, and then it's healed, so there's sort of a broken bone, and then that sort of area there where that bone is healed and sort of on a slightly odd shape. But there was a couple of human remains of bones that were rigid as we were excavating, we noticed had breaks and things like that. Maybe more will come with sort of the post excavation process, the analysis. And then we're looking at sort of status. So some of these chapels definitely have burials within them. So if you're doing quite well, you obviously get a high status burial, and being in one of these chapels is probably quite a good place to be buried away from the rest of the cemetery. So there's a suggestion of status there of these three particular burials within this chapel. And then here there's one that's buried within the south transept, and we think it's in a coffin. You can just see the outline of that coffin, that wood outline there. And the body, just something worth pointing out, the bones, at some stage this coffin's flooded, the water's come in, and as that water's receded, all the bones have sort of dropped in these kind of sort of random places. So there's a skull there, the sort of legs are there, the pelvis has managed to stay in position, everything else has sort of moved out of position, possibly due to flooding. Then we've got some grave goods, kind of, there's a coin or a copper object placed on the teeth of the lower jaw. Interesting to know why that's there, but it's sort of worth highlighting, because we are getting little bits of grave goods placed, probably by mourners. Here's another one, like a folded up piece of lead placed within the grave itself, next to the body. There are other examples of these lead parcels, if you like, possibly with a prayer that's sort of encased within the lead, and then it's placed by a mourner, by a loved one in the grave. And then here we have a priest. And these are more common grave goods we had on this site, where we got these lead sort of pewter mortuary chalices that have sort of, over time, it's kind of compressed, it's squashed, but that would have been a sort of a chalice that would have been put on the right shoulder of a priest, and that sort of indicates that we're looking at a priest's burial. And there was 3 or 4 of those across the site and found during the excavation. And there's a close-up of that lead pewter sort of mortuary chalice. Originally kind of for display, there'd probably be a silver, it'd be made of silver, but then when they put it into the ground, they swap it for a cheaper sort of lead pewter one. That's just a sort of nice photograph of that chalice. And here on this particular priest, over by its hip, we had a buckle, so suggesting that they were buried, he was buried in some kind of robes that had a belt with this buckle. This buckle survived. I mean, probably a lot of the burials were probably maybe wrapped in shrouds. And we did get a coffin, but this is just a sort of example where we've actually got evidence of this particular individual was wearing some kind of clothes or had a robe of some sort. Again, you got this lead parcel, just a close up to show what what it would have looked like, and it's just sort of a bit of mystery about what the sort of what's going on. But we did have more than one of these, so it's just sort of something just tantalizing to sort of suggest that they are these lead parcels that do have this bit of a prayer or some sort of devotion sort of written down and then wrapped in lead and then put within by the mourner in the by the sort of the dead individual. And then this one was found on possibly a high status individual. It's a finger ring, and it was in the south transept on a particular individual there, so suggesting status. He's got a nice, or she'd got a nice piece of jewelry. And then just these 2 objects are nice just to show we're sort of in a church and in a kind of religious setting. We've got a sort of open cross with a saint, I think, praying on that central point there. We think it would have been attached to something because there are sort of like there's holes on the top and the bottom. And then here we have a sort of symbol of the crucifixion. So just sort of devotional objects found during the excavation. And then a very sort of quite a neat little ivory pin with a little decoration of a possible rose, sort of nice sort of object there. And then again, sort of we're in the medieval period, a nice object here, a sort of medieval brooch, sort of made of a kind of copper alloy, but kind of nice object to find. And then just a kind of quick overview of what we found with PCA and over the sort of course from the 2015 excavations right through to the 2020 excavations. So we started with the molar conjecture, which is this diagram down here, where they're sort of finding these columns, the south wall, the north wall, and Barney Sloane's finding a bit of the sort of transept. We've sort of added to that whole sort of area of with the precinct, with the south precinct wall, this gatehouse, this sort of avenue leading up from the gatehouse to a portico entrance on the western end of the church, the south aisle, the two columns, the north aisle, and the north wall, and a bit of the cloister and the cloister alley. And then over down on the sort of eastern end, we're getting the south transept with this big lot, the south transept being here, more of that south wall, and then along here, and then this kind of area here where we've got this quite a sort of late medieval chapel sort of cell. And then there's the cemetery area here, and then a boundary ditch here. So we've got the large cemetery between the church and the boundary on that eastern side. So that's sort of, we've expanded that whole sort of conjecture, that whole model. And then into the sort of 16th century, this is Adam Dant, who's a kind of cartographer, sort of modern illustrator, and he's done a sort of map of Tudor Shoreditch. He sort of, I think this was done quite recently, 2016, something like that. And it's sort of showing Bishopsgate, Shoreditch High Street, and then Holywell Priory here. And then the precinct has kind of changed. It's much more sort of open. Doesn't seem to be owned by the church anymore. And I think that's because of the dissolution, sort of 1538 to 1540, with Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church, and the change in sort of land use at Holywell Priory, and they've even got a theatre on that sort of on Curtin Road. So we're looking at that Tudor phase, which is kind of seen in this overview, where the from the 2015 excavations, where we've got that gatehouse, which has been retained, and that sort of inner precinct, which is probably a sort of open area between the gatehouse and the Tudor house, which has got this entranceway here, and a sort of not a church anymore, but that church has been subsumed into the 16th century sort of dwelling. And this is that close-up of that Tudor house, with a kind of south wing, a west wing, a courtyard area where the cloisters used to be, and then sort of areas of that house. And this is the sort of gatehouse, which I said was retained, probably survives into the 18th century. And there's all these different floors, which are post-med, sort of reused and used as over that period. And then, but the actual main structure stays from the sort of medieval period into the 16th century and right up until the 18th century. Again, we're in the church itself, and we've got these 16th century sort of brick surfaces where we used to have things like Westminster tiles, and we've got cesspits on the inner precinct, which used to be kind of an open area, is now part of this Tudor house. And so this is sort of, that change is kind of reflected in some of the finds. So this is what was called as Pinner's bones. And we've got these little grooves on this bit of animal bone, and it's used to hold metal pins well sharpened, which is an unskilled kind of laborious task. And these have been found on previous monastic sites. So it could suggest we are starting to see a window into the people who used to be in this priory, who are now displaced by this religious house, becoming a sort of a Tudor domestic house. They've got kind of nowhere to go, so they're doing menial tasks in and around the old precinct. So that could just be a sort of window into how that's changed, because it's just sort of interesting that we're finding them on these kinds of sites. But that is just sort of something to think about. And here we've got a powder horn, which is from a matchlock rifle, sort of decorated powder horn, which would have been a high status item to own. If you own a rifle, not everybody would have had a rifle. So we're seeing a change from that medieval to the post-medieval, that ownership, the building's changed. It's now owned by quite a rich individual, probably originally by someone from Henry VIII's court. And that is started to be reflected in the building itself through the structural remains and in the finds we're finding, like this sort of powder horn as part of this matchlock rifle. And then just to sort of add that, so there's another plaque on Curtain Road. You know, these plaques are a bit like buses. I'll show you one now. We've got another, and it's an example of sort of how that land use on the Priory is changing. So it's broken up. It's not part of that precinct anymore. It's now sort of, you can have there's a theatre. So on that, which was formerly the Holywell precinct, has now got a theatre on that land. And also it's worth pointing out that the Westminster tiles were also sort of found on that theatre site during that excavation. So they made them way from the Priory Church into the theatre as part of the decoration of that theatre. And that sort of brings it to an end. I just included that photo purely because it just shows you what goes on these sites. All those sites, you know, everything looks quite clean, and here we've got the chaos of the excavation coming to an end from our point of view, and the construction taking over, and there's an archaeologist just sort of finishing off their recording